All right, so today we're diving into some, well, let's be honest, pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But gotta say, your choice of sources. Super interesting.
Yeah.
You brought in all these Arabic Wikipedia entries on like the Palestinian issue, and it seems like you're really trying to get at something deeper.
Definitely. I mean, what really struck me when I was going through these sources, it's that they don't start with 1948, when Israel was founded.
Right. That's usually the starting point.
Exactly. But these sources, they take you way back, like late 1800s, almost like they're saying, to understand this whole thing, you got to go back to the roots, see how it all began.
Fascinating. Okay, so late 1800s. What's going on then that's so pivotal?
Well, that's when you see the whole rise of Zionism.
Yeah.
The movement pushing for a Jewish state in Palestine, right?
All right.
And with that, obviously, you have a lot more Jewish migration to the region. But, and this is important, Palestine, back then, it's under Ottoman rule.
Okay, yeah.
So you can't separate this migration from that context.
It's not happening in a vacuum.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also when you start to see Palestinian resistance kind of bubbling up, right? Which, I mean, makes sense. It's a reaction to these huge shifts happening around them.
Huge demographic shifts, ideological shifts.
Totally. And it wasn't just like two groups on the ground either. International powers got really involved.
Of course, always got to bring in the bigger players.
Right. Britain especially. Their support for a Jewish homeland. It just threw gasoline on the fire,
Especially with the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Yeah.
Imagine how that landed with the Palestinian population who'd called that land home for, what, centuries?
Well, for sure. And then, it wasn't messy enough already. World War I explodes.
Talk about chaos. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled for ages, collapses.
Just like that. And then you've got these secret deals, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically carving up the region amongst the victors. It's no wonder there was so much resentment, so much broken trust.
Right, like how can you build anything stable on that foundation?
Yeah.
So within, a few decades, you have two national movements, both saying this land is mine, plus all this international meddling, broken promises, the aftermath of a world war.
Yeah, recipe for disaster, right.
It's incredible how deep this conflict runs. Was there anything in these Arabic Wikipedia entries that really jumped out at you about this period?
I was surprised by how much they focused on early Palestinian attempts to organize themselves politically.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like figures like Amin al-Husseini, he becomes a really important figure later on. But even back then, he's advocating for Palestinian self-determination.
So it wasn't just scattered resistance. There was a thought-out movement building.
Absolutely. This was about establishing a national identity, making their voices heard, which is interesting because you don't always hear that side of the story.
It challenges the narrative that Palestinian identity only solidified in response to Israel.
Right. Exactly. So by the mid-20th century, you've got this powder keg, basically. Two groups with conflicting aspirations, the international community stuck in the middle. It's a recipe for, we know what happens next. And, 1947 hits, the UN partition plan. And, wow, talk about a different perspective depending on, where you're standing.
Right. Huge moment.
These Arabic sources, they don't mince words. They call it al-Nakba.
The catastrophe.
Exactly. Heavy stuff. And it shows you how deep this trauma runs, For a lot of Palestinians, it's not some event in the past, it's still present.
It's so different from how, a lot of Western narratives frame it, right? Like, sometimes you hear it as this necessary compromise, maybe even hopeful.
Right.
But from the Palestinian side, it's the start of something awful.
Yeah, and it's more than just the land. Though, the partition plan did give more than half of Palestine to a Jewish state. Even though Jews were minority then.
Right.
But it's the violence, too.
Yeah.
The displacement, the sheer terror of it.
Things like the Deir Yassin massacre. Just brutal.
Hundreds of Palestinian civilians it's burned into their collective memory. These sources, they don't shy away from how awful it was.
You really feel the human cost reading these accounts. How these events echo through generations. The fear, the displacement. It's hard to wrap your head around,
And it doesn't just stop. You
Yeah.
have the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the attempt to set up an all-Palestine government in Gaza.
It was so short-lived.
Yeah, it didn't last. But the source is presented as this act of defiance.
Yeah.
Trying to hold on to self-determination against crazy odds.
So even with everything being ripped away, there's this clinging to the idea of a Palestinian homeland.
Oh, absolutely. Al-Nakba, it's not just history. It's an experience that continues for a lot of Palestinians. It's
Right.
part of who they are, how they see this struggle.
We were talking earlier about those early efforts to build a Palestinian national identity, a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
Did what happened in 48, the Nakba,
Yeah.
did that solidify things? Even with people scattered, living as refugees.
That's a great question. And honestly, from these sources, 100% yes. Being displaced, fighting for recognition, those became unifying forces.
It's kind of tragic,
Yeah.
that this horrible thing, being driven from their homes, is part of what brings people together.
It's true. And that shared struggle, that resilience, is what leads directly to much more organized Palestinian resistance, the PLO.
Ah, the PLO. That feels like
Mm.
we're shifting gears now in this story. Big time.
Definitely a turning point. The
Yeah.
source is presented as this huge deal. 1964, the PLO emerges. You go from scattered resistance to this unified pan-Arab struggle. And at first, it's focused on armed resistance against Israel.
Okay, so now things are getting really interesting. Tell me more about the PLO, especially. I'm curious about their relationship with Jordan. What did you find in the sources about that?
Well, it's complicated, right? Like, you can't talk about the PLO in Jordan without talking about the Nakba. So many Palestinians, they ended up in Jordan after being forced out of their homes.
Right, seeking refuge.
Yeah. Exactly. So naturally, the PLO, with their whole goal of liberating Palestine, they gain a lot of support there.
Like the perfect breeding ground, in a way.
Yeah.
You have all this trauma, this longing for a homeland, and then the PLO comes in with this message of resistance, of return. Powerful stuff.
Totally. And as the PLO gets bigger, stronger, they start operating almost like their own state,
Right.
within Jordan.
Oh, wow. So you've got this tension building.
Exactly. It was bound to cause friction with the Jordanian monarchy, and it all came to a head in 1970, Black September.
Like September. Yeah, that's not a name you forget.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, what exactly happened?
Basically, the Jordanian army, they decided to kick the PLO out, and it was brutal. Fierce fighting, lots of casualties on both sides.
Just another layer of tragedy on top of everything else.
Absolutely. In the end, the PLO is driven out. They find a new base in Lebanon.
It's almost hard to follow,
Yeah.
It's like a play within a play.
Yeah.
The Palestinians are displaced. They find refuge in Jordan, but then their own movement for liberation causes more displacement.
It really highlights how tangled this whole conflict is. And for the Palestinian people, it's another devastating blow. Out of Jordan into Lebanon. And then, of course, they get caught up in the civil war there. It's a recurring thing in these Arabic Wikipedia entries, this sense of always searching, never quite finding a place to land.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
But it also shows their resilience,
Yeah.
to keep going through all of that.
Oh, for sure. And they never gave up on the dream of a homeland, which is what makes the Intifada, the uprising in '87, so important. That was a real turning point.
Yes. The Intifada, those images of young Palestinians facing down soldiers with stones. It really captured the world's attention.
What do these Arabic sources say sparked it? What made that moment different?
Well, it was a bunch of things, right? Growing frustration with the occupation, the economic hardship, the feeling that talking, negotiating, it wasn't getting them anywhere.
Right.
But there was also this sense of, like, their own power,
Yeah.
that everyday people could make a difference. And the Intifada, it wasn't just about fighting back with
It
weapons.
was more than that. It was about civil disobedience, about resisting in every part of life.
Did that change how people saw the conflict? I mean, internationally.
Yeah.
Because before, it was always, framed a certain way, right?
It definitely changed things. The Intifada, it forced the world to pay attention to what Palestinians were saying, what they were living through, and it helped lead to the Oslo Accords in '93.
Oslo. The first direct talks between Israel and the PLO. Big moment.
Yeah.
What's the feeling from the Arabic sources about those accords?
It's complicated. There's hope, right? Because it's like, finally, some recognition, the PLO at the table being taken seriously. But there's also this worry, division even within the Palestinian community.
Because they knew it might not work out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, it didn't deliver on everything. Not even close. There were some wins, some self-governance in a few places, but no lasting peace.
The big issues, settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, none of that really got solved.
Sadly, no. Which just goes to show, even when it seems like there's progress, the core issues, the trauma, these totally different narratives, they're so hard to overcome.
It makes you realize history isn't just dates on a timeline. It's about the weight of those dates, how they live on in people's lives.
100%. But one thing that really struck me going through these sources is despite everything, the Palestinian people have this incredible spirit. They
Yeah.
find ways to resist, to hold on to their culture, their identity. You see it in their music, poetry, even their clothing.
Like that keffiyeh, the scarf, it's become this global symbol of their struggle.
Exactly. It's like when so much has been taken, you hold on even tighter to what remains. Your culture becomes a form of resistance.
It's a powerful reminder the history's alive. It's happening right now, and the stories we tell, the ways we remember.
Yeah.
So where do things stand now based on these Arabic sources?
Still so much debate, right? Two-state solution, one-state solution, it's messy. But these sources, they remind us to really listen to Palestinian voices, to try and understand their perspective, their history on their own terms.
We started with a deep dive into Arabic Wikipedia, and it turned into, well, a much bigger conversation, didn't it? About identity, displacement, the very human cost of history. And I think that's the point, right? To keep questioning, keep learning from different perspectives. Thanks for taking us on this journey.